Hi, my name is Sheela Subramanian. I'm a vice president at Slack, co-founder of Future Forum, and also author of the book, How the Future Works.
Awesome. Well, I am so thrilled to have you here as my first guest at WorkSpaces.
No pressure.
You are a great speaker. I took some wonderful notes. Let's start with this. What's the lift and shift?
The lift and shift is essentially a behavior that we saw when the pandemic hit 2 years ago. What we saw was that organizations made bigger changes than they ever thought were possible in how their employees worked, literally in the matter of days. But most simply did a lift and shift. They lifted existing office-based norms, practices, technology, culture, and they shifted them into people's living rooms. And what we've seen over the last 2.5 years is that we need a shift from the lift and shift and the retrofitting of existing norms to actually redesigning how we work from the ground up.
I'm playing off redesigning a little bit here. I loved how you started a very early part of your speech with really almost the title of this podcast. You said, imagine a workplace. And I thought, oh, well, this is great, right?
I knew it going in. That's why.
So finish that sentence. Imagine a workplace.
Imagine a workplace that is flexible enough where employees feel like they have choice, not just in where they work, but ultimately in how they work. Where all employees feel like they belong and are included within their company's culture. And ultimately, where all people feel connected to one another and to their leaders, regardless of where they work. Imagine a workplace where the conversation around leadership shifts from command and control to trust and transparency. That workplace is here, and now it's on us to build it.
Oh, I love that. Okay, so what can leaders do right now? I mean, what do they need to know right now to begin moving in that direction?
Yes. So a few things. The first thing is that we need to shift the conversation from around flexibility in terms of the number of days you're expecting your employees to come into the office. The trends that we're seeing in the market is that flexibility is not just about where you work, it's about choice. It's about trusting your employees to do good work and also trusting them to live their lives. It's also about having conversation around inclusion. How do we create ways in which we work, norms, so that all people's voices are heard rather than the select few? Because that's what the pandemic exposed to us 2.5 years ago, was that work was fundamentally broken for most of us, and it was built for a select few. So how do we actually rebuild it to be more inclusive for all types of employees so that they stay in the workforce and they continue to be happy and productive employees? And last but not least, connection can happen in many different ways. So how can leaders foster connection in the way that they communicate with transparency, how they trust and lead their employees, and ultimately also why they bring people together to foster that camaraderie and build that trust?
I like how you talked about the middle manager, because I feel like everything you're saying here falls on the shoulders of leadership, and that middle manager oftentimes is just a little stranded out there, right?
Yep.
I mean, you have to be a follower when you're a middle manager. You have to take direction, but then you have to give direction. What can middle managers work on right now? I mean, where should they be growing themselves? How should they grow themselves?
Yes, I think that there's a shift in that conversation, if you don't mind me making it. And this is on leaders to help figure out as well. Because middle managers are struggling. 43% report that they're burnt out. And they are experiencing the lowest scores when it comes to overall employee sentiment across all levels within an organization. And to your point, it's because their jobs have been rewritten and they have to shift from being a gatekeeper to an empathetic coach. And that's really, really hard. And so I think a few things that leaders can do are, yes, they can set their principles, the behavioral guardrails that they'd like to see within their organization, the cultural norms and how they want their employees to work. But then they get out of the way and they empower their middle managers to create team level agreements and figure out what works best for their specific teams. I think it's also important for managers to realize this is not just on them, and for leaders to invest in coaching and feedback and ultimately reskilling of managers. And I think last but not least, we need to have a conversation around who wants to be a middle manager, because this job is really hard and it's also fundamentally changed. And early in my career, it was very much about, you're really good at your job, so now you need to do your job and manage people. And we need to have the conversation of, what does an individual contributor track look like so people can continue to grow and thrive, but they don't necessarily need to manage a large team of people to be successful? And what does a manager track look like? But continuing to assume that everybody is going to be good at being a manager is what's contributing to this burnout and these high levels of fatigue that we're seeing today. And we need to be more intentional about what careers look like moving forward.
I love that. I think there is an old notion of like, if you get really good at your job, that's the next step, right?
Yeah.
And we need to let go of that. There was a comment you mentioned in your speech when you said that over the last 2 years, you felt more connected to your work. You felt a better sense of balance. You felt like you belonged more of the last 2 years than your whole career prior. And I was thinking, it makes sense. A lot of people are feeling this way, but what held us back before? Specifically, why weren't we getting that sense of fulfillment?
Yes. So I think there are a few reasons. The first is so much of how we work is based on outdated norms. You need to come into the office 5 days a week between, let's just say 8:30 to 5:30. If you leave early, your manager's going to look at you and judge you for being a slacker. Why? If you were done with your meetings at 2:00, why couldn't you leave at 2:00 and go enjoy a run or go pick your kids up from school? It was also that the traditional workday was not necessarily aligned with like our lives. And so many of us were juggling caregiving. We were dropping our kids off at school and then sprinting to the bus or jumping in our car and trying to battle traffic in order to then do solo focused work in the office. So it wasn't necessarily giving employees a lot of choice or autonomy in terms of how they worked. Also, I think it's important to acknowledge that the workplace was built for the select few, not for all types of employees. And we saw that in our data at Future Forum. In 2020, in looking at our data, we saw that sense of belonging as well as relationships with coworkers was actually better working remotely versus working in the office for employees of color. And it didn't make sense to us when we saw the data. We were like, how is this possible? Because the office was a place for fostering belonging. And that's where we were wrong. Because the office was a place where a lot of code switching happened. Code switching is the act of changing the way you dress, the way that you talk, the foods that you eat, in order to fit into the prevailing norm. And what flexible work has offered us is the ability to focus on the work at hand and have conversations about that rather than coming into the office, being self-conscious about what we're wearing, wondering who's sitting with whom or how we're going to fit into that happy hour later on in the day. And so I think that questioning a lot of the norms by which we kind of accept it as fact has freed a lot of people in terms of enjoying their actual work rather than focusing on fitting in or showing up as the good employee by being the first in, last leave. So part of redesigning how we work is also questioning the ways in which we work. Take the brainstorm as an example. I'm a horrible brainstormer. I always have a hard time getting a word in. And what we find from our research is that brainstorming is actually not the best way of spurring creativity and innovation. It's not the whiteboard. It's not the board table. In fact, it's the diversity of voices around the room and ensuring that they are heard. And so instead of the brainstorm, consider the brain right, where people can come together in a virtual whiteboard or in a Google Doc and work asynchronously and contribute their ideas in a more inclusive way. And then the role of the leader is to bring those ideas together and figure out a path forward with their team. There's also a new expectation when it comes to leadership. And what we're increasingly seeing is the expectation for more trust and transparency between leaders and their employees. And so some ways that we've seen this work are digital AMAs, where people ask their leaders a question digitally, and then their leaders respond to them asynchronously. But it's a great way of building trust and rapport between leadership and their employees.
And AMA stands for?
Ask Me Anything.
Love it.
Digital Ask Me Anythings. We've also seen asynchronous all hands. Prior to the pandemic, we'd all come together in a room. Those who were not in HQ would feel left out. And so what we have also tried is video asynchronous all hands, where people record a clip of themselves, they give their presentation, and then they post them in a respective channel. And then they get feedback from the broader employee base in terms of questions or things that resonated and things that maybe didn't resonate. This is another great way of building that feedback loop. And there's also listening tours. Listening tours were not necessarily the norm prior to the pandemic, but increasingly so, we need to hear from our employees. So visiting different offices or different teams, going on and listening to her and asking the question, what's top of mind and how can I help? That's going to be a core requirement for leaders moving forward. And you can use technology as well as in-person venues in order to facilitate that.
I absolutely love the words listening tour. Like when you put tour on the end of that, it totally changes the vibe of like what that activity will be. You know, like, it puts no pressure on the outcome. It's just, go and be an explorer.
And you feel like a rock star because you're a good listener rather than a good performer.
Yeah, and great rock stars go on tours.
Yeah.
This is just perfect. This was really good. There was one more comment I'll ask you to speak to. Actually, two quick ones. One was developing not an answer-based mindset, but an experimental-based mindset. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, because I found that really interesting.
Yes. So the last 2.5 years have shown us that every day is different. We don't necessarily know what to expect at any given week, much less any given year. And so much of how we worked prior to the pandemic was based on norms of how we've always worked. And that's no longer working for us. But the problem is, or the challenge is for many leaders, is many of us just want a solution. Like, this is what's going to work for us moving forward. But if the last 2 years have shown us anything, it's that we can't necessarily have just this like fail-proof approach to how we work moving forward. So what we encourage leaders to do is take an experimental mindset and to really see what's resonating, what's not. Run pilots, test out prototypes, and get feedback from your broader teams, and continue to build on those experiments. Because if you expect that you have an approach that's going to work a year from now, that's likely going to fail. But if you embrace this discontinuity around us and you lean into it, you're going to be more successful coming from it. So I firmly believe that those who are leaning into this change, are embracing this disruption, rather than reverting back to how things used to be, are the ones who are going to emerge from this uncertainty with happier and more productive employees, and they're going to come out with stronger business fundamentals.
I love it. I love the leaning into the discontinuity.
Yes.
I think is just a great phrase.
It's kind of an oxymoron. So.
The last one I'll ask is, you've cited some awesome statistics. I don't know if you're interested in statistics, if they kind of stick in your brain. Are there some other like statistics that have kind of rocked your world lately, or some things that we ought to know?
So I think what's really important is that data helps paint the picture of what work is going to look like. And one thing that continues to amaze me is how much flexibility, more choice in how we work, continues to be a core expectation for employees. Quarter after quarter, we've seen that it ranks second only behind compensation when it comes to determining job satisfaction. And so much of the conversation around flexibility continues to be, what percentage of employees want to have flexibility in terms of where they work? It's 80%. But what we've seen for the last 18 months is around 94% of employees want flexibility in when they work. They want to abandon the 9 to 5, and they want more autonomy during their day. And I want us to continue to have this conversation in terms of schedule flexibility, because I think that's what's next that leaders need to be prepared for. And we need to really think about the why behind 9 to 5, the why behind why we have so many meetings, and ultimately how we can help people reclaim their work days to actually do the work that we hired them to do. And that's going to continue to be a focus for us.
I love that. Reclaim your work day.
Yes.
That's so awesome. Well, you were fantastic. Sheela, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.